Welcome to Unseen Whispered. Get ready to feel your heart race.
A Christmas Visitor. It was Christmas Eve in the small, snow-covered village of Ashwick. The streets were quiet, save for the faint sound of carolers singing in the distance. Inside their cozy home, the Miller family was preparing for a warm evening by the fire, the scent of pine and freshly baked cookies filling the air. The tree sparkled with ornaments, and the children, Lily and Ben, could barely contain their excitement for Christmas morning. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden knock echoed from the front door. It startled them all, for visitors at such an hour were rare in Ashwick. Mr. Miller approached cautiously, the creak of the floorboards under his feet blending with the howling wind outside. He opened the door to find no one there. Instead, on the snowy doorstep lay an old, weathered box tied with a crimson ribbon. There was no note, no tracks leading to or from the house. He hesitated but brought the box inside. "What is it, Dad?" Lily asked, her wide eyes fixed on the mysterious package. Mr. Miller unwrapped the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was an antique snow globe, its glass clouded and base tarnished. When he shook it, the snow swirled violently, but the scene inside wasn't festive. Instead of a cheerful winter village, it showed a dilapidated house surrounded by skeletal trees. The family exchanged uneasy glances. Who would leave something like this? Mrs. Miller whispered. That night, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, and the once cozy house grew colder despite the roaring fire. At 3 a.m., Ben woke up screaming. He claimed he'd seen a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, its face obscured by darkness. The next morning, the family noticed the snow globe had moved from the mantel to the dining table. None of them had touched it. Inside the globe, the scene had changed. Now, the dilapidated house was closer, and the skeletal trees seemed to press against the glass. Over the next few days, the occurrences grew more unsettling. Whispers echoed through the halls, and faint footprints appeared in the snow outside, circling the house but never leading away. One night, Mrs. Miller heard a faint melody, like a twisted version of A Christmas Carol, coming from the snow globe. Unable to bear the growing terror, Mr. Miller decided to throw the globe away. He drove out to the frozen river on Christmas night and hurled it into the icy water. The family felt a fleeting sense of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But as they returned home, they found the snow globe waiting on the mantel, its glass clearer than before. Inside, the house in the scene now looked identical to theirs, and faint figures resembling the Millers stood in its windows. The next morning, neighbors found the Miller house eerily silent. The once warm and lively home was now cold and empty, the family nowhere to be found. On the mantel, the snow globe sat undisturbed, its scene eerily lifelike. Inside, tiny figures resembling the Millers waved, trapped forever in a never-ending Christmas.
The Bells of Eternal Midnight. It was the night before Christmas in the isolated mountain village of Eldermoor. Snow blanketed the rooftops, and the streets were eerily quiet. The villagers had finished their celebrations early and locked their doors tightly. For as long as anyone could remember, no one ventured outside after sunset on Christmas Eve. At the heart of Eldermoor stood an abandoned church, its bell tower rising like a skeletal finger into the dark sky. The church had been empty for decades, yet every Christmas Eve at midnight, the bells would toll. The sound was haunting, slow, deep, and resonant, carrying through the village like a mournful wail. No one knew who rang the bells or why, but the villagers believed that if you heard the 12th chime, you'd vanish before dawn. Emily, a skeptical journalist from the city, had heard the legend and decided to spend Christmas Eve in Eldermoor to uncover the truth. She rented a small cottage near the church and set up her camera equipment. "That church is cursed," warned Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly woman who owned the cottage. "You'd be wise to leave before sunset." Emily smiled politely, but dismissed the warning as superstition. By 11:30 p.m., she was standing outside the church, bundled in a thick coat, her camera pointed at the bell tower. The cold was biting, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old structure. As the clock struck midnight, the first bell rang. It was louder than Emily had expected, and the sound seemed to vibrate through her chest. She glanced up at the tower, her breath visible in the frigid air. The second chime followed, then the third. The snow around her began to swirl unnaturally, as if caught in an invisible whirlwind. By the sixth chime, the air grew heavy, and shadows began to move across the churchyard, though no one was there. Emily's hands shook as she tried to steady her camera. The ninth chime brought an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows coalesced into shapes, figures draped in tattered robes, their faces obscured by darkness. They glided silently toward her, their movements slow but deliberate. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice trembling. The figures stopped, but the bells continued to toll. On the 11th chime, one of them raised a skeletal hand and pointed at her. When the 12th chime rang, the world seemed to shatter. The air grew deathly cold, and Emily's vision blurred. She stumbled back, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the church door creaking open, revealing an impossibly bright light. The next morning, the villagers found her camera in the snow outside the church. There was no sign of Emily, but the footage told a chilling story. It captured the sound of the bells, the swirling snow, and the shadowy figures. The final frame was a glimpse of the open church door and a hand reaching out, pale and clawed. Emily was never seen again. From that year onward, the bells of Eldermore fell silent, but the villagers say they can still hear faint chimes if they listen closely on Christmas Eve. And when they do, they hurry inside, lock their doors, and pray that the bells never toll for them.
The Christmas Eve Visitor. Every year, the small town of Willow Creek celebrated Christmas with great cheer. Snow blanketed the streets, carolers sang harmoniously, and the town square glowed with fairy lights. This year was no different, except for one peculiar legend that resurfaced, whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk: the Christmas Eve Visitor. The legend spoke of a ghostly figure that appeared on Christmas Eve, clad in tattered winter robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure wandered from house to house, knocking on doors. If the door was answered, the visitor would simply stare, its hollow, dark eyes boring into the soul of the unfortunate host before disappearing into thin air. It was said that anyone who encountered the visitor would face a terrible fate by the next Christmas. The Harper family had just moved into town and hadn't heard of the tale. They were excited to experience their first snowy Christmas in Willow Creek. On Christmas Eve, as the family gathered around the fireplace, young Sophie, the Harpers' curious 8-year-old daughter, stared out the window. She noticed something odd, a lone figure standing in the snow near their driveway. "Mom, Dad, someone's outside," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. Her father, Mark, walked to the window and peered out. A tall figure, cloaked in shadow, stood motionless. Mark assumed it was a prank by local kids. "Don't worry, Sophie, probably just some neighborhood teenager messing around," he said, brushing it off. But the figure didn't move, not when the Harpers turned off their lights, not when the clock struck midnight. It just stood there, like a statue, barely visible under the falling snow. By 1 a.m., curiosity got the better of Mark. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, despite his wife's protests. "I'll just scare them off," he assured her. But when he shone the beam of light at the figure, it revealed nothing. No footprints in the snow, no shadow. The figure had vanished. Relieved but unsettled, Mark returned to the house, locking the door behind him. "It's gone," he told his family, though his voice was shaky. That night, strange things began to happen. The Christmas tree lights flickered erratically. Ornaments fell and shattered without reason. Sophie claimed she heard soft tapping on the windows, though no one else did. The air grew cold, even with the fireplace blazing. At 3 a.m., the Harpers were startled awake by a loud knock at the front door. The sound was deliberate and heavy, like a judge's gavel. Mark grabbed a poker from the fireplace and crept toward the door, his heart pounding. When he opened it, no one was there, just the endless expanse of snow-covered ground. But as he turned back to go inside, he saw it. A message, scrawled into the frost on the window: "Do not celebrate." The next morning, Christmas Day, the Harpers tried to brush off the night's events. But something felt wrong. Sophie, usually cheerful, wouldn't speak. She sat staring at the tree, her face pale, her eyes wide. When her mother tried to shake her, softly at first, then uncontrollably, as tears streamed down her cheeks. The Christmas Eve visitor always returned.